Good morning. So today we're going to learn about empiricist epistemology, which is the opposite of rationalism. And kind of the mantra of empiricism is trust your senses, and that we learn through experience. So part one, what we're going to do today is the classical empiricists. And then what we'll be doing next class is critiques of this and some radicalizations and how they've brought it into the 21st century. So we're going to start in ancient Greece, as always, with Aristotle. He was Plato's student. He did not agree with Plato that we shouldn't trust the senses, but he wasn't entirely a true empiricist. So we're only mentioning him in the sense that he came up with this idea of the five senses, right? And that we gather data from there to construct knowledge. But to start with the true empiricists, we're going to hop all the way forward to the 1600s. With this dude, John Locke, who was a great thinker. He was a doctor. And he was an advocate of an empirical approach to the scientific revolution. So he really laid the groundwork for enlightenment. His essay concerning human understanding is his theory of knowledge. And the biggest takeaway from him is this idea of tabula rasa, which is that your mind is a blank slate. He also came up with the idea of life, liberty, and property as essential rights that we have. So also a great political theorist, and he laid the groundwork for liberalism, which ends up founding the United States. So one of the quotes to summarize what he thinks is, let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, a blank slate, tabula rasa, of white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? AKA, how does it get ideas? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. So I want you to pause right now, and you're going to go over to your notes, and I want you to discuss with your partner, what do you think of this idea of our minds being a blank slate? We're born, and there's nothing in there, and then we fill it up with knowledge. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are maybe some issues with this theory? And then you can come back here. So now that you've answered that question, what John Locke set out to do was basically prove Plato and Descartes wrong. So he says, how am I going to get rid of these ideas of innate ideas? Sorry, that was redundant. How am I going to get rid of the notion of innate ideas? So he applies Occam's razor, which Occam was this guy. He said, what can be done with fewer terms is done in vain with more, which basically means the simplest explanation is usually the best. And he made this famous by coming up with the fact that our planets, we basically go around the sun in an ellipsis instead of in a perfect circle. And that's why, because scientists have this theory that planets were like going backwards and forwards, and it was just because we're all in this like ellipsis, not in a perfect rotation. So he came up with the simplest explanation, and it turned out to be true. So he's going to apply Occam's razor, kind of like Descartes was like, I'm going to, get rid of anything I can't trust and apply radical doubt. Locke is going to apply Occam's razor. So he also wants to apply it to the Platonic forms. He's like, this idea of forms is crazy. How do I get rid of this? Because remember, Europe is still very religious, and people still believe in the idea of these ideals existing out there and that we're born with innate knowledge, usually that God has given us. So how is he going to do this? He takes his theory of tabula rasa and creates a series of distinctions. He's like, let me look at ideas in a different way. So he comes up with the idea of simple and complex ideas, particular and general ideas, and primary and secondary qualities. And all we're going to look at today is number 1 and number 3. So simple and complex ideas. Basically, he said that the forms is a way of misunderstanding these like abstract ideas, right? So he said simple ideas are those that cannot be further analyzed into simpler components. Think about it as prime numbers, right? You can't divide them. So solidity, yellow, motion. These are all things that we can pick up from our senses. It's not a combination of things. Each one is from one of our senses, right? All these, can be derived from sense, touch, or sight. Notice he doesn't mention smell, or taste, probably because those can be more subjective. So then complex are compounds of simple ideas. Beauty, gratitude, a man, an army, the universe, these are examples. They are also ideas of relations created by setting two ideas next to each other. So, and then comparing and contrasting them, right? This is smaller than this, or larger than that, or what is that? And then you also have abstractions, wherein the mind separates out a feature of an idea and generalizes it, such as blueness. And these abstractions are formed, excuse me, can't read what's on there, when we recognize a certain characteristic that a group of objects has in common. And then we assign it a name, right? So like with blueness, there's a ton of things that are blue and that we would describe as being blue, but blueness is the abstraction, and then we have a group of things underneath that all apply to this abstraction. And he's saying that the forms is a misunderstanding of these general ideas, right? If we think of the word, the example they give in the book is fat. We know what fat is, but then we also have different things that fall into that category. Same thing could go with skinny. So, of course, this idea of sameness that we see with the abstractions, rationalists would counter this and be like, well, where does this idea of sameness come from? That must be an innate idea. So, just so you know how they would be arguing against it. So then we have the primary and secondary qualities. Actually, let me double check. So you're going to pause your video and tell me, what are your takeaways from Locke's ideas of simple and complex ideas? Discuss with your partner, and then I'm going to discuss primary and secondary. So now that you're back, primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities are characteristics that are necessarily part of the object, right? So think about things that can be measured scientifically. Solidity, extension, figure. Is it in motion? Is it resting? And how many are there, right? Our ideas of primary qualities, he says, are correct ideas. These are things that can be proven scientifically. They are correct. We have to trust our senses on these. And then in our mind, these are so when he says our ideas of primary qualities are correct, it's the ideas that are caused by them correctly represent them. So if I see an apple and or if I see a book and I'm like, oh, it's a small book, I'm doing that in comparison. Actually, no. Things you can measure. So solidity, is this table solid? Yes. I am in motion, right? These are things that my brain is telling me, and they are correct because I am representing them in my mind and in your mind then. So then we have secondary qualities, which Locke writes that these are such qualities which in truth are nothing in the objects themselves, but powers to produce various sensations in us by their primary qualities. So what effects do these objects' primary qualities have on us create secondary qualities in our mind? The bulk, the figure, the texture, and the motion of their sensible parts, such as colors, sounds, and tastes, right? What these basically are our experience of things. The ideas we have of secondary qualities don't necessarily represent the world correctly. And there is nothing in our ideas of these things that actually exist in the bodies. Disclaimer, obviously, not everything had been studied by the time Locke was writing this, and we have discovered more, but for argument's sake. So what this is known as is representative realism. It's realism because, it's realism because it represents reality much in the way that like a photograph would, but it doesn't necessarily give us direct access to the object. So what Locke writes is that just as some characteristics of a photo correctly represent the world, right? You can see the image, you see the relative size based on the other objects, what the shape of it is, how many there are, right? But the primary qualities, this is just like how our mind represents primary qualities, just like a photo. But the photo doesn't represent everything, right? If you're watching a video of me, and it doesn't necessarily represent all of V. You're just looking at a 2D representation of V. And it's something you can turn on and off, right? I'm not something you can turn on and off. You wouldn't necessarily say that a video of someone or a photo of someone is them. So he's saying our ideas of secondary qualities are like photographs in the sense that some of the parts are there, but not all of them. And it's different from the actual reality. So you're going to pause right now, and you're going to discuss this idea of primary and secondary qualities with your partner. And you're going to write down your thoughts. So with all of this, here's an illustration of primary and secondary, right? Here's a box. It exists out here. There's extension, size, shape, location, motion or rest. And then in our head, we have our experience of the box. What color is it? What does it sound like? What are the tastes, odors? What does it feel like? And that's our experience, right? That's our data that we've collected through experience with it. And then this is the scientifically measurable data. So with all of this, Locke says, I have totally basically refuted Descartes because I gave an explanation that was simpler than his, and I got rid of this idea of innate knowledge. However, he comes upon a problem, and this is his stumbling block. It's the wall, is what I called it. And it's that of substance. So the first people to discuss substance were Aristotle and then Descartes. So remember the wax example, where he basically, the wax, as it's hard, and then as it melts with the fire, it changes form. So it looks like it's a different substance, but we know that it's the same wax. So he says that we can only know this because we have an innate idea of substance. So because Descartes couldn't come up with a coherent account of substance, he just said it was innate. So Locke goes into this, and he says, our obscure idea of substance in general. This is what his entry is titled. And he says, if anyone will examine himself concerning his notion of pure substance in general, he will find he has no other idea of it all, but only a supposition of he knows not what support of such qualities which are capable of producing simple ideas in us. If anyone should be asked, what is the subject wherein color or weight inheres, like what is this thing that is carrying color and has weight, he would have nothing to say but the solid parts, right? The solid extended parts. So obviously with science, we know atoms make this up, et cetera, et cetera. But this is Locke's wall. So Locke said he would get rid of innate ideas, but this is his wall. He simply says it's something that I don't know what it is. So Locke's confusion could be the beginning of the demise of empiricism. However, he's going to be followed up by this guy, Berkeley, who we're going to see next, who will help him out with this wall that he hits. So right now, you are going to pause, and I want you guys to discuss whether or not you think Locke proved Descartes' idea of innate ideas wrong, and why or why not. And also discuss, so Locke couldn't come up with a definition of substance, so I want to know how you define substance. And then we're going to move on to George Berkeley. So I'll see you guys in a minute. So moving on to Berkeley, I'm going to introduce him first. George Berkeley is a bishop from Northern Ireland in the Church of England, which Church of England is what causes the Pilgrims to move, but the Puritans, excuse me. He saw Locke's errors, and he thought he could fix them by applying Occam's razor more vigorously, right? He's like, okay, Locke had a good start, but he needs to get rid of way more things. He basically critiques a lot of his predecessors. He critiques Locke and Descartes. He specialized in empiricism, in metaphysics, and immaterialism, religious philosophy, and idealism, which, how could he, idealism is where the basis for Plato's reforms. So how do we get an empiricist that also believes in idealism? We're going to see, because this guy is a little bonkers, but hopefully you enjoy his theories. So, and then he is a big influence on Hume and Kant, and we will be seeing Hume next, and we will see Kant the time after that. So you have all these guys just basically reading each other's stuff and trying to improve. So his issues with Locke's theories. Locke had written, since the mind and all its thoughts and reasonings hath no other immediate object but its own ideas, which it alone does or can contemplate, it is evident that our knowledge is only conversant about them. So what does this mean? It's saying we can only know things that are ideas. So I want you to pause and reflect. Can we know something that's not an idea? AKA, it's not a thought in our head. And I want you to write down your answer to that. So now that you're back, Berkeley realized that if this statement was literally true, then it would be impossible to know something that is not an idea. Thus, Locke contradicted himself when he said that we know many of these ideas are caused by real things, mainly by their primary qualities, which produce ideas of both primary and secondary qualities in our brains. So he's saying that we know that these things that are not ideas exist outside, if that makes any sense. So his basically thing was like Locke's contradicting himself, and he put himself into kind of like that Cartesian loop that you guys learned about with Descartes. It's ellipsis. So he's going to break down Locke's ideas of primary and secondary sources, applying Occam's razor. So his step one is to undo the primary-secondary quality distinction. How does he do this? He argues that primary and secondary qualities are really the same thing. How do I establish the size of a table? I look at it or I feel it, right? Looking at it gives me the secondary qualities of color. Feeling it gives me the tactile sensations, right? It is solid. It is tall. So he says our ideas of primary qualities are nothing but interpretations of secondary qualities. So when we look at an apple, right? Oh, did I not even talk about the apple? Sorry, totally skipped over that. So apple is a complex idea. I'm going to use it now. He says it's made up of the simple ideas of red, sweet, hard, round, right? We look at this and we may see perfect, right? This looks like a perfect apple, but this idea of perfect is the abstraction. Because it looks like a perfect apple, we know the concept of perfect, we know how to apply it to things that fit into that category. So this is exactly what Berkeley is undoing, right? He's saying this isn't simple and complex, this is just our idea of the apple, right? It's not that it's made up, like, our idea of the apple is we get these simple ideas and turn them into complex ones and we give them a word. And that language component is going to be really big in Berkeley's theory. So he says our ideas of the primary qualities are just interpretations of secondary, like I said. Red, round, sweet, hard, apple. So he basically turns this into his theory of knowledge. He argues that all of our ideas, except the ideas of self and God, are nothing but our ideas of secondary qualities or interpretations of them. So everything is a collection of ideas. He says a certain, a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistence have been observed to go together, are accounted for one distinct thing, signified by the name apple. Other collections of ideas constitute a stone, a tree, a book, and the like, which, as they are pleasing or disagreeable, excite the passions of love, hatred, joy, grief, and so forth. So what he is arguing is that once we've collected all of our sense data, we have put it into words. And how do we do that? So Berkeley said we start at the beginning with what he calls ideas or sensations, and which basically is sense data. So babies are born. He's a big fan of tabula rasa. He did like that from John Locke. And they're given sense data, which are color, sounds, taste, odors, and tactile sensations, right? These don't constitute the world, but 5 fluctuating worlds. So when a baby is born, they've got 5 different worlds going on because they have all this information coming into them. And slowly, he says, the child learns to read this data by recognizing patterns, right? Okay, this is happening multiple times. If these things have similar characteristics, they must be related. So, however, rationalists, of course, when they say recognizing patterns here, they're like, okay, how do you recognize patterns? You must have an innate ability to recognize patterns. And through parents teaching them language is the other way that they learn to read this data, right? When we learn words, it's because we've learned what sound is equated with what data, right? If we go back to apple, we've learned that apple means this red round fruit. So it's just like, if you think about it, when you see something that you've never seen before, you try and apply multiple words to it that are like, okay, well, this sort of looks like a, I don't know, it looks like an apple, but maybe it's not an apple, but it has similar characteristics, etc. It's how we make sense of the world. So he then radicalizes his theories, though. Click off of this, thank you. I'm not going into present mode because I'm going to lose video. So he says a physical object is the totality of its sense data, aka anything that we don't perceive, any sense data that an object doesn't produce means that it doesn't exist. An object is the totality of its sense data. It is whatever it feels like, sounds like, looks like, tastes like, smells like. So sense data are exclusively mental. It exists only in our minds. So basically, objects only exist as possible or actual perception, which is where he comes up with this phrase, esse es percipi, or percipi, to be is to be perceived. So this is a version of idealism because it prioritizes the mental world over the physical world. In his more radical view, only the mental worlds exist, in the sense that something in the physical world that is not perceived cannot exist. What he means is, like, let's all think of my classroom, right? None of us are at school right now. If we all think of my classroom, for those of you that have been there, you have a mental picture of what my classroom looks like, right? And each of us, because we each have different experiences, have a different picture of what my classroom looks like. And right now, it only exists in terms of memory and perception, or the prediction of sense data based on memory, because we aren't actually there and we're not seeing it right now. So let me check if there's a question. So I forgot to tell you to pause earlier. So there are 2 questions. 3 questions. Do you think Berkeley did a good job of tearing apart Locke's arguments, why or why not? Going back to the slide before, of primary and secondary qualities. And then from a scientific point of view, what's wrong with the idea that an object is just the totality of its senses? Does science give us more data, or is it actually, but is the data science is collecting just a collection of sense data? I don't know. So, and then the next one actually you'll answer after we watch this short video. So what we're going to do is talk about this idea of to be is to be perceived. This is where his ideas get a little bit crazy. So a physical object, here's my classroom, by the way. So now you have a picture of it, which is only a 2D image. So you're not actually getting the full experience. A physical object is just the totality of its sense data. Sense data is exclusively mental and exists only in our minds. So this version of idealism, which, oh my gosh, I was going to delete this from the previous slide. I'm so sorry. I messed up. I already went over this with you. But yes, now you know. So to explain this is this wonderful video. And then you'll answer the next question.
Houses, mountains, rivers, trees, they're all out there even though no one's there to see them, right? Possibly. But according to George Berkeley, if they are still there when we're not looking, it's not for the reason that most of us think it is. Bishop Berkeley argued for immaterialism, the view that there is no such thing as matter. All that exists in the world are our ideas and perceiving minds. This sounds absurd, but it's a subtler view than Dr. Johnson thought when, learning of Berkeley's position, he kicked a stone and declared, "I refute him thus." Berkeley would have expected Johnson's toe to connect with the stone and to hurt, but his point was that what we call matter is really just actual and possible sensory experience, including the experience of stubbing your toe. There are lots of ways you can experience a stone. See it, smell it, touch it, kick it. But Berkeley didn't think that there was a material object lurking beyond the sensory properties causing them. The stone just was the experience. To be is to be perceived, or, in Latin, SAS Percipi. What about that tree falling in a forest with no one to see it or hear it? That's not perceived, so does it exist? Well, Berkeley thought the tree does really fall, and not just because there would probably be insects and birds around perceiving it. A deeply religious man, he thought that God perceives everything. So everything continues to exist when nobody's looking because God always has his eye on it.
So, an interesting theory. You are now going to pause and answer the question, what do you think of his theory to be as to be perceived, and does it have any standing? So now we're going to look at the ideas of language that Berkeley had. And he basically says that, okay, so sense data appears in natural patterns, right? We all know red, yellow, orange equals fire equals hot, right? We associate these colors with these things. They're patterns in the world, and they help us make sense of the world. So he says language is used to unify these ideas in our minds. So as we've talked about, like, what if we all see color differently, which we do? And we've learned, however, that whatever color we're looking at, we've all learned the sound that goes with that color. And so it bridges our different experiences and our different interpretations of the world. So what this also does to refute Descartes' idea is that if his ideas of theories and substance and innate ideas were true, then we would all see the world identically, right? If we're born with all the same material, why do people see the world differently? So sense data is what we all agree on existing, that we each live in our own realities, is kind of the takeaway from this. One of the examples, too, that they give is, like, we have the word snow, and then if you go to Inuits, right, who are surrounded by snow, they don't have a word snow. They have multiple words to describe snow in all of its different forms, but they don't have necessarily the word snow. If you look at Spanish versus English, right, you have to be in English, one word, and then you have ser and estar in Spanish, because that culture has given more meaning to these different feelings. So yes, so language helps us agree on our multiple realities. So I want you to pause right now. And what is something new you learned about language as a concept? And then we're going to talk about this idea of God as the ultimate and eternal perceiver. So where does all of this sense data come from? This is another wall. This is Berkeley's wall, right? Descartes and Locke said sense data comes from substance, but where do substances come from? Both Descartes and Locke, who are both deeply religious, said they come from God, right? So basically, what we're going to see later on too with theory of philosophy of religion is there are two answers, God or an infinite series of causes. And we're going to see what a lot of philosophers have to say about this. So it can be one or the other, right? Matter comes from an infinite series of causes, or what we call God created it. So to Berkeley, God is the eternal perceiver. He's what is allowing our universe to exist. However, this is the mix-up. How can God, something which we cannot perceive, exist in a universe where to exist is to be perceived? So Berkeley then said God's not an idea, he's a notion. And he kind of just left it at that. He had backed himself into a corner, but David Hume will bring this to another conclusion. So this is just a little cartoon. Where is God? He is in our mind. Okay, so you're going to pause again, and I want you to answer the question, how would you solve the quandary of God as the eternal perceiver, but is also that which we cannot perceive? Or can this be solved? How would you solve it? You guys can discuss this and then write down your answer. We're almost done, I promise. So now we have David Hume. David Hume is this guy. He lived 100 years later than Locke. So he became a librarian at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He always wanted to be a professor. He never really made it. He is victim to what they say. He came up with all of his ideas young and then didn't really move forward from there. So he was really skeptical of the ideas of innate knowledge of God and causality. So he wrote this book, Treatise of Human Nature, and he said that there is not experiential continuity of selfhood. In fact, there is no experience of selfhood at all. So he's going to attack this notion of the self. So basically, these guys are just tearing down everything that Descartes and Plato built up. He's a radical empiricist, and he created the term logical empiricism or logical positivism, which is going to create an entire movement called logical positivism, which we're going to see in the next section. So he was very committed to the blank slate theory, Occam's razor, denial of innate ideas, and that all knowledge comes from sense data. However, he, because he can look back at what other people did, he said, Locke and Berkeley were not consistent. I will do a better job. So he divides things into these ideas of analytic and synthetic propositions. He called them something different, but Kant is actually going to also use this theory, and Kant is the one that calls them analytic and synthetic. So Hume says there are two kinds of sentences, right? Those that express relations of ideas, which are analytic, and those that express matters of fact, which are secondary. So let's look at analytic propositions. One, their negation leads to self-contradiction. They are a priori, which means after, which means they were learned after, they're not, that should be a posteriori. Well, anyways, they're true by definition and they are necessarily true. Yes, a priori, like they are true without needing experience. So yes, they are a priori. So let's look at this analytic proposition, which is that all triangles have three angles. So let's look at step one, self-contradiction. If you deny this, you say something that is self-contradictory. I cannot say all triangles do not have three angles because a figure without three angles is not a triangle. So the sentence is also a priori. You don't discover its truth by looking anywhere or by counting angles. You understand its truth by contemplating its meaning, right? You don't need experience to have dealt with this. 3, the sentence is true by definition. A triangle is a three-sided closed figure, so it must have three angles, and only three angles. It's a conceptual truth, right? And 4, the sentence is necessarily true. It can't be false given the conventions of the English language. If there's another, like if we're doing this all in English, the sentence has to be true, right? So this is an analytic proposition. And basically, even though there is a priori knowledge, it is never about anything but itself. So he's saying, yes, this is a priori knowledge, like innate, but it's not innate. It's just that it exists without experience being needed. So they never tell us about reality, but only about the thing. And these are tautologies, which is why I had you look up that word tautology last time. They are basically definitions, parts of definitions, mathematics, and logic. They're all true, but they can only show how we relate ideas to each other. A equals A, 2 plus 3 is 5. Brothers are males. So what I want you to do is answer the question. Oh, actually, we need to get through synthetic. Sorry. And then you'll answer a question. So now we have synthetic propositions. He says these are the opposite of analytic. They have to be derived from sense data. So an example is Miss Biven has brown hair. To find out if this sentence is meaningful, we must see if the key ideas are traced back to simple sense perceptions. So you all can all see me. Do I have brown hair? Yes. So then this statement is true. Even if we're all seeing the brown differently, we've agreed on the fact that this is brown. So another thing, anything that is not analytic or synthetic is nonsense, he says. And this also gets rid of the idea of God, because it is neither analytic nor synthetic. Hume assumed that it was not God, but universal causality that holds the universe together. So what about Descartes' idea of self, right? Because the two things that Locke and Berkeley couldn't account for were self or God. Hume says there is no selfhood. It is just a collection of sensations, and that we invent this idea of self. So before I go any further, I want you to pause and I want you to write down your individual description of yourself. How do you describe yourself? So once you've written that down, you can come back to this. So I want you to think about now what Hume has said. There is no selfhood. It's just a collection of sensations. I am hot. I am cold. I am, it's all perceptions of ourself. Another good question is, has anyone actually seen themselves? Or do you only see reflections of yourself? and photos of yourself. And as we already learned, reflections and photos are not the real objects. So just something else to think about. So he said this discovery, or not he said, somebody else said, this discovery cuts to the heart not only of the philosophy of rationalism, but also of Western religion and common sense itself. Basically, Hume, with his synthetic and analytic propositions, got rid of the ideas of God and the ideas of self. Or did he? So, now you're going to answer the question, do you think you are just a collection of perceptions? Was Hume right? Why or why not? So, Hume leads to logical positivism, which we're going to see next time. I'll see you guys Monday. I hope you had a wonderful weekend and enjoyed this.